Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. My name is Dr. Leslie Harris. I'm going to be with you the next couple of weeks to talk about qualitative data analysis, specifically thematic analysis. And really, hopefully, this will help you with your research projects, dissertations, capstone projects, to be able to really develop a complex and nuanced qualitative analysis that is grounded in your participants, your research participants' lived experience, so that you can really do justice to the stories and experiences and perspectives that are shared by the people that you partner with for your studies. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. All right, so I'm calling the first part of this two-part series coding qualitative data. So we're really looking to move beyond indexing and towards insight. And then we're going to go a little bit deeper into maybe second cycle coding strategies, more conceptualization of data in the next section, and really talk about writing up your qualitative results as well. So we're going to really focus on very basic, descriptive, qualitative analysis, really trying to generate some categories and some themes so you can use that for your projects. I'm going to be drawing today really from three sources. The first being Johnny Saldana, who's a professor at Arizona State University, and he works a lot in education and theater arts. He has a coding manual for qualitative researchers, which really breaks down the mechanics of coding. Secondly, we are going to draw from Kathy Sharmaz, who writes a lot about constructivist grounded theory. But I've been asked today to talk to you a little bit about the philosophical underpinnings and the theories behind qualitative data collection and analysis. And I'm really going to draw from her work to talk about that with you. Lastly, we're going to talk about a collaboration between Miles and Huberman and Johnny Saldana, where they really get into this methods source book, which really takes you through the entire research process of gathering qualitative data, analyzing it, and writing it up for dissemination. So I'm going to start a little bit with Sharmaz's work on philosophical assumptions. So qualitative methods is really an interpretivist, constructivist worldview and paradigm. We believe that there's multiple truths that exist related to any situation. We believe as researchers, we come into the field with our very own assumptions, our very own worldview. Kathy Sharmaz really calls this the wind-shaped tree. We are all the wind-shaped tree. So the decisions that we really need to make in actively engaging in social science is how and when and why do we actively incorporate our assumptions about the world into our research? So in qualitative research, because it is the self as the research instrument, we really believe that it's impossible to not bring our assumptions into the research field. So what we do is we make these explicit to our readers, often our research participants. We write them up in positionality statements in our work. And we have a set of philosophical assumptions that inform the choice of theories that guide our research. So this has a lot to do with epistemology, which is the philosophy of science. So the philosophy of science that we subscribe to in qualitative work is the constructivist interpretivist paradigm. And I've created a little chart here to really juxtapose that with positivism, which is really the dominant epistemology in, I would say, American social science. So the constructivist interpretivist worldview is also very heavily used globally. So you want to think about that as well in terms of, where we are at in the terms of the United States and social science progress versus global perspectives. So as constructivist and interpretivist, rather believing that everything exists is based on certain laws, facts that are fixed, we believe that human beings are actively engaged in a process where we're trying to make sense of our world. We believe that social phenomena are the result of human interpretations. We are actively interpreting the world around us. We believe that people create certain social phenomena that cannot be measured. So let's juxtapose this for a minute with positivism. So there is a very heavy focus in positivism as it relates to methods to rely on quantitative methods. We compare one fact with another and calculate if there's a significant difference to really get at truth, meaning what is truth with a capital T. Compared to us in qualitative methods and us that abide by this constructivist, interpretivist worldview, we believe that these things cannot be measured. So it needs to be explored and described qualitatively. We need to get as close to our research participants as possible. We need to get to know them. We need to get that to spend time with them in the field. We cannot discover the truth without, by handing them a survey, let's just say. All right. However, when it comes to embarking on your research project, dissertation, capstone, whatever you might be involved with right now, if you can answer your question quantitatively, by all means, answer it quantitatively. However, for those that are involved in qualitative research, it really rubs up against a lot of the critical pedagogy. So those that are engaged in description and thick, enriched, nuanced descriptions of human experiences, those that are involved in thematic analysis, those who are trying to actively generate theory in their area. This heavily has to do with dynamics related to race, gender, power, and class. This approach also allows us to actively engage in theoretical work in other domains, for example, incorporating critical race theory, critical theory, feminism, queer theory, disability theories into our work. And so I just ask you, prior to embarking in a qualitative study, which one of these approaches really resonates with you, with the work that you're concerned with doing in the world and putting out in the world? Also thinking about the work of international research, really kind of trying to break away from more of a Western paradigm of research and connect to global scholars as well, who are heavily using qualitative methods in their work. So what am I talking about when I refer to the philosophical underpinnings? Really, in the philosophy of science, we think about this really on 4 levels. So we think about the ontology. So what is the nature of reality? Epistemology, which is really the philosophy of science, what counts as knowledge, and how are knowledge claims justified? So that those first 2 really have to get at what is truth with a capital T. Third is axiology. So what is the role of values in research and the values related to the researcher? And lastly, methodology, which is actually the process of research. So after these next couple of slides, we're really going to jump into methodology. So what is the process of conducting qualitative research? Okay, so how does the role of ontology all the way down to methodology really play out in qualitative research? So ontology is that we embrace multiple realities and we intend on reporting on these multiple realities, so we do not regress towards the mean. We fully aim to report on the full spectrum of participants' experiences. And a lot of our analytic work goes into categorizing those experiences so that we can report on the range. Second is epistemology. Like I said earlier, we aim to get as close to participants as possible. We believe that our evidence, our scientific evidence, is based on individual views, and that is how our knowledge is known. That's how we are actively producing knowledge, disseminating knowledge. Axiology is that as researchers, as I expressed earlier with our positionality statements, we make our values known in the study. So what am I bringing with me into the field? And lastly, our methodology is inductive. So it's from the bottom up. So we don't use pre-existing theory and actively place that on our data set to analyze it, we are in the process of induction. So we're doing grassroots, ground up work that's emergent. We're constantly moving back and forth simultaneously between data collection, data analysis. A methodology is shaped by a researcher's experiences in the field and therefore can change and be shaped by our participants. Our research questions often change. Often we go into the field with a research question that has zero relevance to our participants. And so therefore we actively can change that in the middle of a study. And we lastly seek out negative cases. So we don't delete negative cases from our data set. We actively incorporate them into our analysis. So moving on from theory, how do we do this? How do we actually start to code and break down a transcript? So when I refer to transcripts, we're sort of skipping ahead a few steps. So where I'm assuming you are in your coursework is that you have an understanding of qualitative data collection. So you might have gone out into the field or participated in a project where you have a data set, which are transcripts related to your participants' lived experiences and their rendering of those their experiences, they're sharing their perspectives, their experiences with you as a researcher based on interview guide questions that you are really walking them through. Okay, so what we really need to know is how do we break down our data set to build it up later? So we have a conceptual rendering of our analysis that incorporates all the beautiful things that we've already talked about so that we're actively able to reflect on a range of our participants' experience. We can reflect on this using thick and rich description. We can reflect on this thematically. We understand kind of the full scope of our participants' experiences. We do this through coding, and a code is in qualitative inquiry is really a symbol. It's a word or a short phrase that is symbolically assigned, and it usually means to summarize a segment of data. It's salient, it's essence capturing. It's an attribute for the portion of language based, or we can also use this on visual data. It's not a precise science. It is really an interpretive act. So coding is based on our interaction with the dating set, ours being the researchers, the research team. So coding is just one way of analyzing qualitative data. It's not the way or the only way. So I'd like to start with an analogy because I know that you all have been probably heavily influenced by quantitative measures and statistics. So just as these kind of measures and statistics are numeric, symbolic summaries, so 87%, 9 out of 10, 63 years old. Qualitative codes are language-based. They're symbolic summaries of textual and visual data. It's usually words or phrases rather than numbers that we interpret for meaning. So here are some coding examples from Johnny Saldana's textbook. So you can see, and I'm going to go through examples very quickly, but I'm really going to give you the PowerPoint slides to work through because you will be bored to tears if I read all of our transcripts and then I tell you about why each code was assigned. What I want you to really do is kind of just take in the coding examples and then read through them later so that you can really build up your skills. So I just want to show you how qualitative researchers in this slide apply code. So you can see that there's little stanzas. So we're breaking down the data, really going line by line and assigning a single word like stability or a short phrase like sense of self-worth to each line as appropriate. So the goals of coding are really to reflect deeply on the meaning of each qualitative datum. So datum is the singular word for data. We want to condense, but we do not want to reduce data. We don't want to take the richness away from our participants' very words. So we also actively incorporate our participants' very words into our data analysis. We want to find patterns. We want to develop themes, categories, concepts, and these later on allow us to make assertions about our data. They allow us to make claims about our data. So this initial coding process, according to Kathy Sharmaz, is referred to as just the bones. So we're trying to identify bones at this part of our analysis, and later on, we develop them into more of a working skeleton, which is kind of the whole scope of our qualitative analysis. So we do this. We really build themes by individually line by line coding our data and then categorizing it. How do we go about categorizing? So according to Guba and Lincoln, who are other qualitative authors, is that we look for codes that look alike and feel alike. And we categorize them together, and then we might be able to come up with a code that has earned its way into our code book that we might lay over our entire data analysis. So categories embody and label the patterns you've found and constructed from your qualitative data analysis. Categories, so I'm going to use the word category and theme kind of interchangeably because that's the way it happens in the literature. So let's say a theme label, a category label, like a code, is usually a word or a short phrase that symbolically assigns this summary, but it's more of a higher level of conceptualization. So we have to learn really good, strong coding to be able to get to a really good, strong thematic analysis. So I'm going to give you an example. So let's say we have a category or a theme. This is actually an example from Johnny Saldana's book. So he works a lot in education. He works a lot in the theater arts. So he does a lot of work in schools. So he's done some work on bullying in schools. So his example, which is very basic, and forgive the lack of complexity related to this example, but I just think it's good to start with the basics. So let's say we have a theme or category of physical oppression. That might have been generated from our data set by 3 different codes: pushing, fighting, and scratching. So let's say there's another category or theme related to verbal oppression: name calling, threatening, laughing at. So you can see how the ones towards the bottom, the codes, are more specific, but we come up with our categories based on maybe a higher level of conceptualization. And then that leads us to look at patterns in our data. So let's say this data set is on schoolyard bullying. We have found through this analysis that there's 2 types or maybe more of oppression, physical and verbal. And then we can ground it in our data by saying we have generated these codes, and then we link them to our participants' very words, our interview data. So just to push the pause button for a minute, coding and recategorizing is a process. Very rarely do people get it right the first time. In fact, Johnny Saldana and Andrew Abbott like to say that qualitative data analysis is like decorating a room. You try it, you step back, you move a few things around, you step back again, and then you try a serious reorganization, and so on and so forth. So it's something you really need to lay out. So recoding and recategorizing examples are in his book, From Codes to Theory. So I would love for in this class, you all to be able to get to this idea of themes and concepts. Assertions and theories take a lot longer time. You typically do those later on in your career as social scientists once you've done several studies around the same topic. But what you can do is really start out with your data. So let's say you all these chunks of data, which are in your transcripts, you code them all, you categorize them, you create subcodes, and then you recategorize them again to create themes or concepts. So that's kind of a conceptual roadmap. You can also see later on, you can diagram. So this is a diagram from Johnny Saldana's book, which really talks about transitioning from mid-career to retirement. So you can see that he's really come up with like 3 career phases based on the data: continuing career, career bridge, non-career bridge, and fully retired. Just some examples to take you through. So let's go through the mechanics of coding, because in a minute, we're going to try our hand at coding using a transcript that I have provided you. I've used this with several students. It's from a study that I've done in partnership with Dr. Jelani Kerr in the School of Public Health and Dr. Timothy Crawford, who is now in the School of Medicine in Ohio. But we all started together as first year professors, and it was one of our very first studies of older African Americans who are living with HIV. And we tried to examine how stress and stigma impact engagement in care. So I'm going to give you a transcript from a participant. I'm using his code name, Topher. I am also going to link a monologue project that we did with Topher. So we had his story portrayed by an actor named Kronsky. And so if you want to get more of a feel of Topher, so Topher and Kronsky worked together over several weeks to develop this monologue, which was from the transcript of the interview that I did with Topher. And so you're going to kind of get an understanding of the complexities, the nuances, the perspectives and experiences that Topher shares about being a person who is an older adult who's living with HIV. And I'm hoping you can really use that transcript as a training ground to understand the mechanics of coding. So the first thing you want to do is kind of format stanzas. So I've actually already pre-formatted that transcript for you, but you really want to give yourself space. So I've formatted, so to the left, you will see the transcripts, and to the right, you will see a giant text box. So you want to be able to format that so you have a place to take notes. You want to engage in what's called a pre-coding exercise. So you want to read through the entire transcript and the entire interview. So I've just given you one page of transcript, but if you were to do this in real life, let's say we're working together as part of a research team, you would want to actually read your entire data set. That's really step one, to familiarize yourself with the data. So you want to make some preliminary jottings in the margins of your transcript, and you can really do that even as you're formatting your data. So here's an example about, noticing that this had to do with student debt or anxiety. So it's not really code, it's just kind of a pre-coding exercise. Then you want to lay everything out and get into different coding strategies. So I'm going to give you a couple basic coding strategies, and then next week we're going to go more in depth into maybe deeper, more complicated coding strategies. But I just want you to practice this week using Topher's transcript. So this is what Johnny Saldana refers to as coding as a lumper. So you can see there is a large passage of data, and what he has assigned to this large clump of data is a lot to learn. That's actually a phrase that is embedded in some of the writing of this participant, or some of the transcript, I should say, since it was an oral rendering. So they were speaking these words to a researcher. The researcher transcribed this, and Johnny Saldana assigned this entire section a lot to learn, to really talk about the situation of somebody transferring to a new school. They had a lot to learn about the kids, a lot to learn about the culture. I had to learn the language, etc. So this is actually a study that he did with brand new teachers who worked in inner city schools in Phoenix, where he works now. So he really encapsulated this segment as a lot to learn, to describe the learning process of new teachers. So the second technique is actually a technique I like to use more, especially for my first round of coding. So using the same transcript with new teachers and inner city schools, Johnny Saldana likes to go line by line. So he likes to go through and pull out, keywords. So reality, I thought I was so ready, being in a unique situation, inner city schools, I really had to learn, the culture, a lot to learn. So you can see that this is more detailed, more nuanced. And so this is really referred to as coding as a splitter. So you're using these codes to break down your data. Okay, so some things I would recommend is I always love to code with having some essential references on hand, vocabulary builders, thesaurus, dictionary, so because you can get really creative with your coding, language, and words. I often like to look up the definitions related to what my participants are saying, their very words, to try to pull out maybe a deeper meaning. So the great things to have on hand. You can do this. There's all sorts of coding software, and we're going to get into those a little bit later, but you can really do this based on words. Some of the most famous qualitative researchers do not incorporate software into their data. You can do this using Excel by highlighting chunks of data and then assigning them codes, and then later on code definitions. You can do qualitative software. This is Atlas TI. I like to use Deduce. A lot of people like MaxQDA, but this is known as Cactus, which stands for Computer Assisted Qualitative Data Analysis Software, which has also become very popular. Okay, so what do we do? How do we really move from coding our data, breaking down our data, back to putting it back together conceptually and disseminating our findings? So the foundation of doing this is really what's called writing analytic memos. So we write memos about our codes and our coding experiences. And this really helps us to think about our data. So I'm going to quote Robert Stake, another famous qualitative researcher, who says, good research is not about good methods as much as it's about good thinking. So writing about our codes, trying to define our codes, trying to write about maybe connections between our participants, help us generate this reciprocal relationship between the development of our coding system, also known as our code book, and the evolution of understanding the phenomenon at hand, which is usually your research topic. Codes are prompts or triggers for writing about deeper meanings that your codes invoke. Memos are sites of conversation with ourselves about our data. Later on, they become sites of conversation with our audience when we are disseminating our data and our findings. So writing is really about thinking. So it documents our reflections about the data. So what do we do? In a minute, I'm going to ask you to try your very first crack at analytic memo writing. So I want you to think about, prior to us engaging in a very simple 8-minute free writing exercise, I want you to think about, what do we write about when we get stuck, when we're analyzing our qualitative data, when we're trying to move from coding to analysis, to writing up our analysis. We might want to create a descriptive summary of the data. We might want to talk about how you personally relate to the participants or the phenomenon. That's using our positionality, looking at actions, reactions, and interactions. That actually connects us back to some of our philosophical underpinnings of pragmatism, symbolic interactionism, interpretivism. The participants' routines, we focus on rituals, rules, roles, and relationships, a lot of ours. We also want to focus on, what do we find unique, intriguing, unusual, surprising, disturbing about what our participants are saying. That usually helps us generate new knowledge if we focus on those things. We try to create operational definitions for our codes, and we also try to look at patterns. We could look at possible networks. We could dive back in the literature and look at extant theory. We could look at any problems that we're having with the study. We can also write about personal and ethical dilemmas. We can kind of write a meta memo that is like a collection, a reflection on the collection of all of our memos. And it helps us get to some tentative answers related to our research study questions. So when I'm memo writing, I usually like to do it in a messy way where I'm not thinking too hard. I will usually go back and revise my memos over and over again. I really like to engage in a process where I have my research questions really close by to me so that I'm not getting too far off topic. Okay, so here's an analytic memo example. So this is from Johnny Saldana's book, and he talks about drama as therapy. So this is actually a study that he has done with students who are in a drama department. So you can see that within this excerpt, which I will let you read on your own time because you have the PowerPoint presentation, he pulls out damaged goods and hiding secrets. So as just someone who's looking at the page right now, you're like, wow, those are kind of higher level concepts, but we're going to really need to define what we mean by damaged goods and hiding secrets, because those can mean a lot of different things. So we do that through our memo writing process. So you're going to reflect on and write about your code choices and their operational definitions. So you can date your writing, write your code down, which in this case is damaged goods. What you want to do is try to write code definition, because the analytic work for this memo is to really try to define it. So Karen's descriptor of damaged goods referred to her physical inability to bear children, but I inferred, and I is the researcher's voice, that emotional damage also resulted from her childhood sexual abuse and her parents' breakup. So you can see that the researcher is actually inserting themselves in the interpretive process. So I'll let you read the rest of that on your own time. But here's another example of an analytic memo that really is using the same data set or the data excerpt, but the researcher is really aiming to reflect on and write about possible networks and processes. So this is maybe a higher level of analytic memo, maybe when you have more coding under your belt, when you've spent more time with your data set. You're going to look at links, connections, overlaps, flows amongst codes, patterns, category, and themes. So he engages in a process called code weaving, where he's really taking all of the codes that he has gathered through one transcript and he's kind of weaving them together. So sketching around the codes, I formulated that positive experiences with and the therapeutic benefits of drama and theater can break through the protective layer of hidden secrets some may place on themselves. So you can really see how he brought together keeping secrets and damaged goods into one place through code weaving. So also you can do some diagramming. So I always love to bring into class lots of materials to draw, lots of paper. We get up and draw on the board, because sometimes drawing out your data is the best way you can kind of get to this higher level of conceptualization. Okay, so I would like us to do a quick practice activity. So I have given you all TOEFR's transcripts. So it's a one-page transcript, really easy to manage. I want to tell you a little bit about TOEFR, because I think in addition, if you want to watch his HIV monologue, it's a very quick, only a few minutes. You'll get kind of a deeper understanding of his life story. But just to conceptualize and contextualize, so Topher, using his code name, lives in a smaller rural community in Kentucky. He is one of the only members of his community that identifies as Black or African American. He loves his town. Very few people in his town know that he is living with HIV. He has very close and tight relationships with this town, with the people in his town. He works part-time, so he really does have to, because he's on disability, through having HIV and other chronic health conditions. But his transcript, through you'll see, is really about the relationships that he has in his community and kind of the assumptions that people have based on his physical appearance and not knowing too much about his HIV status, and the perception that he is a physically strong individual. So you will see that there are underpinnings in that transcript related to race, gender, power that come through. So just be attuned to those pieces of it and try to actively incorporate that, if you see it in the data, into your analysis. So This kind of work is best done in teams. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 of us who engaged in this analysis along with 3 other students. So we were constantly coding, memoing, coming back together to really kind of check each other, also understand how our own biases are playing into the data analysis, really coming up with some peer debriefing, consensus building processes. So we're not seeing ourselves in the data, but really trying to stay true to Topher's experience along with our other participants. So how do we go about this practice activity if, let's say, we were working together as a research team? So I've given you Topher's transcript. This is really your practice transcript. I want you to try to just read through, and I've given you a lot of space in the margins. So try to do some pre-coding exercises. Just go through, make some preliminary jottings as you're reading through the data. You can either demonstrate coding as a lumper or coding as a splitter, as we gave those examples earlier today, as you're working through the transcript. So I want you to, after doing those 2 exercises, really going line by line, trying your hand at coding, either labeling a word or a phrase that actively summarizes some of the things that Topher is talking about. After you identify a code that you feel really great about, so like Johnny Saldana's example, damaged goods, I want you to do an 8-minute free writing exercise. So here's how I do this. I set my timer on my phone for 8 minutes. And I have my code in front of me. Let's say that's damaged goods. And I just start typing. I try to define the code. So what is happening here? What is happening in the data? What does it mean? And I want you to not stop writing or typing for 8 minutes straight and focus on developing a definition for your code. All right, so I'd like you, I'm going to move on in a minute, but I'd like you to hit pause on this video and go through one last time. So we're going to take the practice transcript, do some pre-coding jottings, try your hand at coding as a lumper or coding as a splitter. And I want you to write an analytic memo that is aimed at trying to define one of your codes. All right, 8 minutes begins now. When you all come back, I just want to say thank you. I'm going to be with you again next week, and we are going to go deeper into the analysis process, but that will give us a great start, a foundation to build upon. And then I will see you next week for more first cycle, second cycle coding strategies, and more conceptualization. All right, take care. Bye.